You usually had to pronounce it that way, right?
Guten
It's
Tag.
Guten Tag. Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
We can speak soft in German. We sometimes, if we wish to.
Salut tout le monde. No, I shouldn't. Nobody's going to understand except for German and French audiences. Bonjour, everyone. I'm Joe. Welcome to the show, I guess I'll say. I'm joined by, I'm going to be honest, one of my favorite YouTubers, Emperor Andariel. Welcome.
Oh, thanks. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Now, Andariel, you have a channel where you talk about all sorts of things from your books, which are mostly in Deutsch. And you discuss things like politics, literature, cinema, like just the breadth, the length and breadth of the topics you discuss. And you've sent me a few of your essays and theses as well, translated, of course. Sadly, I don't understand Deutsch yet. I plan to start fixing that next year, but in January. But the length and breadth of the topics you analyze in writing, in video format, is honestly astonishing and breathtaking. And we're going to be discussing today, well, the nature of, I guess, what I call mythic fiction and horror. Now, the thing with mythic is, I know that most people prefer the term fantasy, but fantasy has become a bit of a loaded term and a bit of one that...
Yes. I understand perfectly. First, thank you for saying such kind things about me. I have the benefit of having much time with the downside of not having much money. So that's why, just as a side note, you always trade one for the other. But anyhow, yes, fantasy has a little bit this ring of it's just entertainment, it's just escapism, and especially, I don't know if it's I would be quite interested, is it in Canada for once and in French culture for the other the same? Because here in Germany we have two terms for culture. There is so-called high culture, and anything a book reviewer, for instance, would never in Germany review Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or something the like. We have in Germany a still quite functioning distinction between mere entertainment, which is not worth mentioning in German culture still, even today, and then this high culture of all the great authors of old, usually. And this is something I found quite baffling, because going right into the topic, what is a story? A story is a parable telling us something. And why is a story in a fantastic, in a fictional world, like be it a religious story, biblical, Greek mythology, or in a created universe like from Tolkien or from Lovecraft? Why is a fictional parable worth less in their view, like something that is set in the real world? I find that baffling and would ask you, is it the same in French culture, in French Canadian, or in Canadian culture?
Well, French Canadian culture or in Quebecois culture is the same as the culture as France. So, like French magazines in Canada or in France, it's the same. I will be honest, I cannot tell if France takes her cues culturally from Quebec or vice versa. And there's even French magazines now in Japan and whatnot, as there's a growing diaspora over there. And it's the same, culturally, it's the same as in Quebec and France. It's not that I'm trying to be stupid. It's just I don't know which one sets the trends. It just baffles me. But as for a high and low culture, there is such a thing. Fantasy is considered something that is just for children, and there is no, like, all the fiction that of this genre that is written in French is of terrible quality. There is not a single one that is well written or very good. And the thing is, what this has bred in a lot of French people is a disdain, well, at least amongst critics, a disdain for the genre. But there's a healthy respect for the English and the German fantasy stories and the Japanese ones, because they're considered of proper quality. Fantasy writers, to quote some in French, must write in English, German, or Japanese, but never French, because French is not the language of fine literature anymore. But the trouble with this is that it's breeding amongst a lot of French people an inferiority complex and an anger in regards to this distinctive disconnect. But Tolkien has entire societies, conventions, festivals, and whatnot in a lot of French-speaking places. So that, and I myself have been reading the Conan, the French Conan translation, and it's musical and poetic, and it's beautiful. The Hour of the Dragon, ou L'Heure du Dragon, in French, and it reads as well in French as it does in English. The French Tolkien, well, the French Lord of the Rings is not very good. It's not a good translation. But the Silmarillion I intend to get into and start analyzing the differences and whatnot. But already some of the linguistic differences are fascinating to read and look at. And the thing about the term fantasy is, what sort of fantasy are you talking about? Is what I tend to think of. Are you talking about sexual ones? Are you talking about ones of a fantastical sort of, sword fighting and whatnot, of knights and of old French or Germanic or English or Scottish culture? So I ended up just discussing with other writers and philosophers over in Substack the idea of rebranding the genre, because there's also the problem that a lot of the dumber writers out there tend to take the attitude fantasy and science fiction are the same thing. They're interchangeable. They're not. These are two opposite genres. Science fiction, or I should say futuristic stuff, looks to the future, whereas the opposite genre looks to the past, to myth and history. And it's a derivative of medieval literature and ancient classical literature. For example, I read Lord of the Rings, and I'm seeing more of an influence of Les Chansons de Roland, that is to say, the Song of Roland, where he, has his horn and he blows into it and it shatters, and there's the charge against the Saracens. I see more a connection between that and Theoden than I do, let's say, Brave New World and Lord of the Rings. I don't see a connection. There's no similarities to my mind. So we ended up kind of starting to just call it mythic because it's more mythological. You know what I mean?
That is, if I may, that is an interesting note which you may or may not know, because the first translation into German was written by one Margaret Carew. I'm utterly butchering her French surname, and I don't know if she was why she had a French surname, but it was in 1996, and it was a wonderful translation. It is really such a wonderful, poetic, old-fashioned style of German, and it was met with great positive emotions and is quite regarded as the best today. But then something happened just a few years ago. There is a man, Wolfgang Kriege, and he's really knowledgeable about Lord of the Rings. He has written manuals, dictionaries, what have you. But he was tasked for, I don't know, whatever reason, I have a guess, to retranslate it. And then suddenly where Frodo was, how to translate it in English, where Frodo was the was Lord Frodo or something the like. He was suddenly the boss. Or more clear it is like in the past in Margaret Carew, they were going to a tavern, they were then going into a bar. So my impression was that they wanted to not overwhelm a so-called younger audience or new audience with a too alien, too high language which Miss Carew had. And it was much disliked, or I shall almost say hated by most of the Tolkien fans. And it's nothing against the translator Wolfgang Krieger. He is really an expert, and he has written. I have a manual of the sages of Middle Earth. It's called it would be called in English, and it really shows a deep understanding of the character of the world. Speculating like, is Sauron some sort of industrializing or whatever? So many speculations and fantastic perspectives. But he had this, and this is we have since then 2 translations. What I lost the track is I don't know which sold more, if the old one is still available. I stopped, but it was really something that alienated me. Why should we not demand young people to learn this old-fashioned language?
Yeah. Well, in French, most of the, like, what's interesting with French is when it comes to, let's say, a higher form of French, it's more formal French, and there's informal French. But there's not as much of a distinction, I guess you could say. And looking at French manuscripts and whatnot from 500 years ago, despite the spelling being different, the French has not changed from then to today. And there's not, like, there's High German and High Japanese and High English, and there's a low form of the language in linguistics. French is different.
It's more a sort of vocabulary. Like if you read the biography or autobiography of Otto von Bismarck, which I did, and it was extremely strenuous, even for me, because there was extremely long sentences in the 19th century and the 18th century too, where people write. But it's the same in French. This super length sentences where you really had to pay attention to what is it about. And in German, that is often the verb at the end of the sentence. So at the final climax, you know what it's about. It's what Mark Twain wrote, a mocking and not entirely wrong book about the difficulties of the German language, because it's often that you have a long sentence and then at the last 3 words, you understand what it was about.
Well, in French, for example, I'm reading Le Comte de Monte Cristo. I actually don't really, I don't really care for how most will try to translate it into English. It should just stay Comte de Monte Cristo. Le Comte, how do I put it? The sentences and the dialogue are the same as you'd find today. The language has not actually changed at all. Les Trois Mousquetaires, like, if you were to publish a novel, like, how do I put it? My French, when I am writing my novels, is more formal than Alex Dumas' French. Victor Hugo also wrote a little more formally than Alex Dumas, who's probably my favorite. But the French is not different. And if you look at historic documents and volumes from the 19th century and mid 20th century, let's say, and even documents like the letters of Jeanne d'Arc, which I'm very fond of, or even Les Chansons de Roland, which I'm also rereading, the French is generally the same. And that's the language weirdly hasn't changed much in centuries. And
was it standardized so early, or did this just happen?
It standardized around the time of Richelieu and Louis XIII establishing l'Académie Française. They really standardized almost everything. But before
Because
that,
just interjecting to an understanding, if I'm correct, French has I think it's the Académie Française, which gives the standard language, which we don't have in German, and I don't think they have in Britain either for English. Is
they
it
do.
correct or is it wrong?
I think so. But in English, Tolkien undertook a lengthy project with other professors at the behest of Oxford to standardize English, or at least a good deal of the lexicon and dictionaries and grammar and whatnot. All I know was he undertook a great grammatical linguistic standardization project for the University of Oxford. But I don't know if Anglo-Saxons have followed it since. I know there was talk by Shippey, his biographer, who said that there was a lot of things that Tolkien established that were struck later on. And
because I noticed in English and German there is you could fill an entire small lexicon, both in English and in German, of words which were known 80 or 100 years ago, and few people know. For instance, the word, like I said mentioned in the translation, a tavern, was replaced by a bar, and we have the same in German, Taverne, which is tavern.
Why?
It's literally the same, just differently pronounced.
And
there are many words like balderdash, for instance, is something that's stupid. It's something that a modern American or English speaker probably wouldn't know. And I've read long lists of so antiquated words which our grandparents or great grandparents knew in English and in German, and which are just lost to knowledge.
Well, I don't really, because all I read are old antiquated books, and except for one or two of today. And the only stories I'm reading of authors today are those who prefer older English. The English I speak and I kind of grasp is older in its, but all I know is like Tolkien's English and Howard's English, something I'm more at home with. Today's on Twitter, I keep asking people, what does this mean? What does that mean with this slang and whatnot? And I can't keep up. And or you look at other websites and I'm constantly told, even in real life, it's exasperating for me. It seems like the language keeps being reinvented. And I keep asking, what does this mean? What is that? What are you doing with the language? I don't understand. And I keep getting told, get with the times. Your English is too old, too formal. And it's like, I still use tavern as a term.
I'm focused much on an older English, and I noticed it when I went to school. And basically, I learned English from video games. You see, I'm 53, so I was a teenager in the early 80s. So back then, most games were text only on little primitive images. So I had to. There were no translations in German or any other. They just came from America as they were. So I had to learn English that way. And I remember a word like law, like something that is common knowledge, like I don't know another English word for law. So that was a word that I knew from these fantasy games, and that even my English teacher didn't know, which was to my surprise. But that is, my English is also very influenced by this fantasy old style English.
I think, though, honestly, I learned my English the same way at about 6 to 7 years old. I had to learn. I was told one day to the next, you must learn English. Tu dois apprendre anglais. Naturally, I was utterly flabbergasted, and I was told French is not allowed in the house anymore. So I was kind of very confused. But the only way I could learn was by watching, that I enjoyed at first, was watching video games. And there were all these text-based things. Suikoden was the first one I liked. And I was able to start understanding and grasping the language because the story was fascinating. naturally, I had my brother kind of translating and explaining to me. And then by like the fifth or sixth, no, I think by the third or fourth time he played it through, I was able to actually start understanding and reading the text myself. But that was like a year later. And I remember being pleased that I understood English at 7. But it took me almost 2 years to finally understand. And then I was started reading voraciously. But I have to admit, I preferred my French books until I was 11 and I discovered The Hobbit. That was the first English book I really felt matched French literature. But when I tell this to most Anglo-Saxons, a lot of them are annoyed or think, well, there's not been any remarkable French literature since Victor Hugo, so we have you beat. And it is a funny little competition, and they are quite right. But when it comes to the, but that said, I do believe that French is due for fine literature again, but it's just a matter of the right authors and literary minds coming back or like arriving on the scene. I often think it's kind of like when the student is ready, the teacher shall appear, except when the reader is ready, the author shall appear, like with Shakespeare, Tolkien, or Howard. And I do. Now I'm going to ask you regarding horror. Why? Now, this was a topic you're very keen on. Why do we tell horror stories?
Can I go back a question further? Before that, that is on my mind even before we began our live stream here, and this is what is the function of these myth of fantasy stories anyway? I have something in my mind, but I would let you go ahead unless you want me to go ahead first. But
I can go
please,
ahead.
this is your channel, so go ahead if you have a definition or a set of ideas about this. Why do we do this? Why do we tell stories of not real worlds and events?
I think, well, I'm going to harken back to Robert E. Howard and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, because they're the finest. I think the others aspire after them, but I think that those two, what sets them apart is that they were creating national mythologies for England and Texas. They stem from a love for, in Tolkien's case, Edith, his beloved wife, and his children. In Howard's case, there was love for his girlfriend, Noelle, and there was also love for Texas for Howard and love for England for Tolkien. But what they were trying to do was they loved reading Norse sagas. They loved reading Greek myths, but they found that there were no such stories for Texas or England, respectively. And they sought to make those sort of stories, to create, I guess you could say, a song in a way, like a hymn that could valorize, validate, and embody the very spirit of their nations, of their people, their love letters. How did I word it in a previous essay? I called it their attempt to court their nations. They were courting Texas and England, respectively, and the tribes that they belonged to, that is to say, the Texans and the English. This is what it means to create a great romance. I'll use that term instead, because they're doing what Liu Guanzhong, I think it is. My pronunciation must be terrible. Apologies to the Chinese, if there's any Chinese who listen. Who wrote Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and there's also, I believe, someone else who wrote Journey to the West. The thing is, those stories are creating a mythology for China and are the great romance of China, the grand epic. So these are attempts to court, to valorize, to uplift the nation. In the words, I guess, of Shakespeare, we happy few, we band of brothers we lucky few, or something to that effect, from Henry V.
Yeah.
That's what it kind of reminds me of. That it's meant to make it, the people within that tribe, bring them together, give them a shared love for one another. That's what I think it's for.
I find it most interesting that you mention the place, which is something where I realize how changed as a German I am post World War II. I'm sorry, I have to go to that, but it is something that I just realized now that you mention it. I mean, the way when the Americans came here, they essentially took the Brother Grimm stories as trophy. Yeah. And so now we get them back in the version of Disney. And the strange thing is, I don't think that many Germans know the stories of the Brothers Grimm very well or at all. And I think most Germans know the Brother Grimm stories only in the Disney version, which is kind of sad thinking of it now. But I've read the Brother Grimm stories when I was a child, but I was already a very exotic stranger doing that. And it's not something common, I think. And then when I think of the great other German story of the medieval ages, the Nibelungenlied, the Nibelung song of Siegfried and Hagen and the treasure of the Nibelungs. This is mostly, I think, I have to say it that hard way. After the World War, the second especially, maybe already after the first in a smaller sense, the Germans more and more, there is this concept, I have to mention it, I'm sorry, going a little bit into this, because I realize it as I listen to you. You see, the World War for Germans is like a black wall of time, and anything behind it is invisible, is like gone.
Oh,
so sad. It's like if you go to school in Germany, and I was born 1971 to just sort it in. You learn a little bit. Oh yes, there was Charlemagne, Karl der Große, and there was Stone Age German tribes, and then you immediately jump to World War II. That is essentially which makes 90% of this. And I'm not going into detail saying it's good, it's bad. I'm just mentioning it, that even I was already a stranger. And if you ask me about great myth of the Germans, I can think of ballads like small song like the Erlkönig, the Earl King, which is maybe known as the song to an international audience because it is one of the most known. Like the father riding with his son, and the fairy king is pursuing the son, and it's quite dramatic. And I think Schubert has made a song with it. So anyway, so there are ballads, which are small mini stories. There are the fairy tales, mostly of the Brothers Grimm. And there is the Nibelungenlied, the Nibelung song. And even then I have to think, there is something else, something medieval, something of the Parzival, Wolfram from Eschenbach.
Oh, I know that story. Sorry.
But I haven't read it ever. I just know the synopsis of it. But I haven't read it ever. There is no real reason why. But this disconnect. You see, just to top this, I was born in Swabia, southwest of Germany, but I grew up since I was 6 in West Berlin. And if people had asked me until 1990, what am I, then I would never have answered German. I would always have answered, I'm West Berliner. Because I felt that the West Germany, and of course East Germany, is something entirely different. Like West Berlin was a culture in itself, just existing since a few decades. And this I've written, as I'm a historian, a social scientist, and I've written several articles about this strange phenomenon, like we Germans are cut off from the mythological and and fantasy past of Germany. And on top, I have to say, German writing fiction were always relatively serious, with a few exceptions, like in the Weimar Classic era when Goethe and Schiller were known. Then it was different, or Hölderlin or other writers of that era. But Germany doesn't have much fantasy, or I don't think there is any fantasy in the thing of Tolkien or what came later in the English-speaking world. That is the only one I can think of is Wolfgang Holbein, who is the most successful in German language. I think a few of his stories were made into films or music, movies. I don't know. Not such a big fan of him, so I can't say. But German is very literature. So there is so much serious stuff, which is, I have to admit, maybe to your shock, I'm not a big friend of anything which is written in German in the case of fictional. I'm not very in love. Most stuff is boring, is like trivial. It's not nothing that grasps my heart, my soul.
It's the same in French, although with the French, the sad thing is most French, even fantasy writers or mythic, well, they should be aspiring to be mythic writers, they cannot capture the spirit of pre-modernity. Like they overlay the values, ideas, and just the Republic, I guess, over everything. What I mean is there's a black wall between them and the Revolution, La Révolution Française of 1789. But the minute you start talking, what of the traditional values? What of un roi, un roi, un foi? What of France before the Revolution? There's always a sense of, no, that's dangerous, that's bad. The Ancien Régime, that is to say, France from the age of the Romans up to 1789. Like there's a lot of French that take pride in it. Like France was the mightiest of nations of Europe. She was the greatest. But then if you say, let us try taking the values and ideas and history and myths and fairy stories of that era, let's give them to the modern audience, there's a bit of a nervousness that starts to appear. And not many are, well, no publisher or writer is really at ease at that point. So I think the same black wall exists for my people. And weirdly, when I'm asked what am I tend to say I'm French. But people seem to mistake me for actual French, or some say, but you're not really French. You're Quebecois or you're French Canadian. But the thing is, francophones, I guess to use another term, are not really accepted in Ontario. But if you go to Quebec, you're accepted as one of them. So I don't belong in Ontario, but I'm from Ontario. I don't fully belong in Quebec in some ways, but I'm not from Quebec. But in my case, I consider myself French. That's my culture. That's the roots of my ancestors, of my forefathers. So for me, I have the luxury of being able to say I'm French, and most French people will understand what I mean when I say je suis francophone. They could tell from my accent where I'm from, but then they'll say with a dazzling smile, I'm glad you consider la douce France éternelle, gentle France the eternal, your mom. You belong to her. How blessed you are. How blessed we all are. But the trouble is that sentiment belongs to the Charlemagne era, to the Carolingian era, not to the modern era. So the French are a weird bunch. We hunger for our previous history before the revolution. We hunger for it. The fastest growing political parties in France are monarchist parties who want to return to a feudal monarchy. But the problem is there's also a black wall that we ram our heads into. So there's France and French society is in a weird flux right now. And I think we're in the same situation as you Germans, except it's not 1945 that serves as the wall, but 1789 thereabouts. And it's such a strange thing that's happened to our people.
It reminds me of something which I noticed. I may not be entirely correct. Correct me if I'm mistaken about this. You may know that I'm a pagan. I am since I'm 16 or 17. Yeah. And I know that paganism spread in, let's say, every or almost every Western European countries. After the fall of the wall, even in Eastern European countries, like Baltic countries, for instance, or in Ukraine and Russia, some who went to, I don't know what it is. I don't just remember how the paganism of them is. Rotnoveri, that is how it is called, right? Ooh. And then there is paganism in on the British Isles, of course, which is largely either Azatru oriented towards the Norse, or that is something Gaul, meaning of the Celtic root. And something that I found quite astonishing is I never heard of any French pagan group at all.
Because in place of going, well, France has not had pagan influence since she was Gaul under the Romans. And the trouble is there's no, like, we know what the Celtic pantheon looked like due to the records, like of Cernunnos and all that. But there's no, how do I put it, cultural memory. There's weirdly a romanticism for the Christianity of the era of Clovis and Charlemagne. That is to say, the ancient manifest destiny, the Catholic Frankish manifest destiny to spread French culture and Catholicism to all the corners of the globe. And there's no pagan group because the French are disconnected from paganism in a way, mentally. And instead,
I bring this up because I have this idea that, I mean, we know that J.R.R. Tolkien was a very strong Catholic. Yeah. And then we see Lewis, who even, I mean, in his, it's supposed to be a Christian parable. The lion Aslan is Jesus, and still there is a strong paganistic element in each of these worlds. And I have a hard time to imagine that if you are a Christian, where do you? I mean, you have fauns, you have satyrs, you have minotaurs, even in the very Christian, what is this, the Lion, the Witch on the Wardrobe of C.S. Lewis, which is very, even Tolkien was quite a strong believer in Catholicism, lambasted that the Christian religion was so prominent in C.S. Lewis' work, which Tolkien disliked. And there are very little, and I would say almost no hints. If I wouldn't know, I admit I would not have guessed if Tolkien was a Christian or a strong believer or anything. There is no Christ figure. The god Iluvatar is a very distant god who just creates the world and then never intervenes, I think, one or twice, but generally not. And this is apparently the fantasy lives with taking something from the rich tapestry of pagan characters, and this is something that you have even in the Arthurian story, which is almost entirely in the Christian setting. Mostly there are some hints in the older stories, but in the version that we generally know, but still there are some mysterious pagan beings here and there. Or in Beowulf, if you go further back.
I love Beowulf.
This is something that, if we go into fantasy, like taking, for instance, Lovecraft, we see quite strong. But before we get lost in that, let me give you an idea, because I ask you the question, my take on it. It is more an abstract thing, maybe a typical German way to approach things. And the question is, where did it start? I imagine people of the Stone Age sitting in a cave and an old man at the fireplace tells a story of something that happened when he was a young boy that an old man then told him. And of course, it is a teaching about things. Despite not being a big fan of Professor Jordan Peterson, he said something very interesting, like about the biblical stories, like mythology in general is like a sum of human knowledge, of human perspective on things. And let me tell you one example which exemplifies this. And I'm telling this as someone who stopped being a Christian when I was 16. So just to say why the story has such a meaning. You have to know one thing, besides North Korea, East Germany is the most atheistic place in the world, to my knowledge. And I remember being a West German, being West Berliner. I was in the early 1990s. I had a friend from West Germany who had moved to West Berlin, and we were invited to a birthday party. Everyone had grown up in the East, in the GDR, in the socialist Germany. And someone was telling something of a situation where he thought he wanted to escape, but he knew inside there was no escape, he had to face it. And I was laughing, and I said, that's like Jonah in the belly of the whale. And all the eyes of the East Germans were looking at me as if I had told something in Chinese. They had never heard of Jonah in the belly of the whale. And despite me already then being not a Christian and an apex of disliking Christianity, which is, thank goodness, far behind me now, but at the time, it was still normal for me to know these parables. And I realized, because it's Jonah, for those who don't know the story, Jonah is chosen by Yahweh to a sort of prophet, to announce something. I'm not entirely sure what it was. And he lets himself swallow by a whale in order to block out the voice of God, which is, of course, ridiculous. And that's the meaning of the parable. Like, there are things you cannot escape from. And I meditated and thought about this experience a long time, and it still shocks me that there are people now growing up who don't know these stories, who just don't know it. And for me, it is something like that resonated strongly with what Dr. Peterson, Professor Peterson said, was people who don't know these parables don't know the idea behind it. And that is what I mean, what my perspective is on what is the value of fantasy, of mythology. It is, in a nutshell, to tell in a parable an idea which otherwise on pure reason level is way more difficult to grasp than in the elegant simplicity and beauty of a parable.
The thing about story, about fiction, is it's a variant of philosophy. It's there to present an idea, as you said. What I do agree with everything you said. I was going to just comment. The story of Jonah, apparently he seeks to flee from his duty to God, according to the story. And the men aboard the boat throw him overboard out of fear. And Jonah is swallowed by the whale. But he's supposed to be saving a certain city. And he doesn't want to. But then when he arrives there, because he's forced there by God, Jonah warns them that God will smite thee if you do not throw over your demons and worship him, and you must be better people. You have to be kinder, you have to be better. So the people then immediately listen, and Jonah's angry because the thing is, to him, he complains also to God, they're not even Jewish. I am. How come you're willing to treat them the same as you would a Jew? And God pretty much tells him, I'm not just your God, I'm everyone's God. I'm here to love everyone, not just the select few. And he reveals to Jonah the test was for Jonah, not just the people, but it's also about Jonah. And Jonah fails the test. He stays in the area because he wants to. He keeps complaining to God throughout the rest of his life that God must smite the city. He wants the city destroyed, and God never destroys it. He blesses it and continues to love it. And so Jonah dies a bitter old man who has no love in his heart. So it's also, I think, a parable about the importance of having an open heart with other human beings and being open to grace and goodness. The people of the city had it. Jonah didn't. So much as we tend to think the test is only about for the people, it was also about Jonah, and Jonah failed, but the people passed. So it's a very interesting story. I remember weirdly finding it very amusing when I first read the story at 6 years old, because I read the whole Bible at that age. I just thought it would be an interesting undertaking at the time. And I remember just giggling at the image of a man being swallowed by a whale. The problem was my family would go to Marineland, a popular theme park in Canada at the time, and we'd see these orca whales, and I loved orca whales. So I just imagined them swallowing a man and spitting him out because he didn't taste very good. At least that's how, I just assumed, well, he was also spat out because the whale didn't like the taste of him. And it created in my mind a funny little image of an orca and Jonah. And this sort of, what I find very fascinating is that when teaching when teaching Anglo-Saxon students, they don't know these stories. They don't know a lot of these mythical stories or biblical ones or many very old ones. But when teaching in Japan or Quebec, my students know these stories. They're familiar with them. They're raised with them. So it's something of the truth within these stories that's conveyed within them. The cultural, because, how do I put it? Myths and stories are also the meats and potatoes of a society. It's how you pass down your values, your ideas to the next generation. And the next generation's not going to have the same values as you if you don't pass down the stories you were given as a child. In a way, stories are the nation, are the culture, is what the culture is. But if you let's say, if Beowulf, Shakespeare, Tolkien, if these aren't passed down to the next generation of Anglo-Saxons, are they even English anymore? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's I'm not trying to be snobby. I just mean, are they even?
No, that's an interesting question, because basically I'm sometimes of the cynic impression that Germans today are just Germans by name. In that sense. And I mean it absolutely serious. And I'm not even saying, it's like I can't even say when this happened. It happened in steps over the time. It's something that most of my fellow countrymen from the one side do not care to hear, and the other side will be quite angry if I said this. But it is an impression, because if I think of even not so far away authors like Goethe or Nietzsche, and I wonder how many Germans know what Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, or what Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote, some of the arguably two of the greatest German minds of not so distant a past, then there is a growing number of people who don't even know those names.
What?
It's shocking. Yes. I have a small funny story which I told many times to my German audience in German. So I pass it on to you you mentioned I have a YouTube channel. I'm also talking about philosophy and social science and history.
Yeah.
And I mention many of the classic Roman and Greek philosophers and authors. And I've read Plutarch's biographies. He wrote about ancient, I think it's called on ancient, on great Greeks and Romans, or Romans and Greeks. And it's his famous biographies of Plutarch. And I said in one of my videos, Goethe and Nietzsche said, one cannot call himself an educated person if you have not read Plutarch. And I told this on my videos a few times. And then there was a man, older man, and he was really, I don't know, I say simple worker, like building bricks or something the like. And he was so fascinated from me telling it that he bought everything from Plutarch, including the Moralia, which are really very difficult to read because the last translation is from 1824, which is a really, really complicated writing even for me. And he read all through this simple bricklayer, I shall say. I'm not entirely sure if it was his job, something along those lines. He was so fascinated. He read it all and he was so enthusiastic. And then he told me the following story. He had at the time 2 sons, 15 and 17 years old. And he told them his enthusiasm about this Greek, then in Roman, Romanized, this Romanized Greek Plutarch. And he said, Goethe and Nietzsche said one is not an educated person if he has not read Plutarch. And his 2 sons going to typical German schools, being 15 and 17, asked, who are Goethe and Nietzsche?
Oh my God. I'll admit, I knew Goethe before, but I didn't know Nietzsche until I was in university. But then I had to read every single one of his works as part of an English
even if you
book.
just know that's a philosopher, and Goethe is an author, but they didn't even know these names. That was shocking. There are certainly philosophers and authors of German I know very vaguely. I did not read the entire Bildungskanon, the canon of education that once was the canon of German education, to which reading the classics was a fundamental part of German education, to read the Roman and Greek classics. But
I read Nietzsche.
Just this one sentence. This is largely due to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He had his Italian journey. At the time, it was among the upper class in Europe typical to have a journey, usually to the classic areas of Greece and Italy, and to learn these. And at this time in the, I think, 18th century, it became educational canon for people who call themselves educated men to know about these people. And they didn't even know the people of the 19th century. Whatever you think about Nietzsche, he was one of the greatest German thinkers that ever lived, and Goethe, one of the greatest German writers that ever lived, and they didn't even know their names.
Wow.
This is why I'm saying, what Germans are there today, but other than in name?
Yeah, I can see why you'd say that. Sorry, I'm floored because I read and I didn't agree with every point Nietzsche made, but I still enjoyed reading Thus Spake Zarathustra. And I don't I still have my copy. I haven't touched it in years, but wow. Okay.
Imagine an American who answers you, I've never heard of Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain. There may be Americans who don't know this. Education is going downward in many areas of the world, but it's like, wow, how can a German not even have heard of these names? But I know this, but I know why. I can tell why, because I was in school in the 70s, 80s. I was born 1971, so I was in elementary in the 70s, then in middle school and high school in the 1980s, and I know exactly why. West Berlin was a left-wing apex at the time already, and we were reading something based on a work of Goethe, and I had Leistungskurs. I don't know how to say this. It's when you specialize on two areas, two fields. One was German and the other was, I don't know, history or something the like. And so I had a special, more elaborate version of German, which is not just the language, but the culture, the writing. And just once our female modern leftist teacher, and I speak of the 1980s, mentioned Goethe 2 times. Yes, we're reading this modern piece from that time then, which was very, very vulgar, I might say. And I'm not saying this, I was not very sensitive at the time, I'm not generally, but it was really vulgar, primitive, and boring. And it was based on Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, the suffering of young Werther, some of Goethe's breakthrough works. And she just mentioned Goethe's name twice. Yes, this new work is based on some old stuff from then and then from a guy called Goethe, but you don't have to know this. We are now going into this modern stuff. This is where it began. It was, I have to say this, I'm sorry. I think it was purposefully taken away.
I think that's the worst part, is that it's been purposely torn from the Anglo-Germanic world. And I just say that because I have a lot of American and Anglo-Canadian friends and whatnot who they teach. And the thing about teaching French students and Japanese students that surprised me was they still cling to old myths, old stories. In some of my ESL classes in Quebec, I'd start teaching, and the students insisted I use Thor and Odin as names for examples of figures having a conversation. And they insisted on discussing the Prose and Poetic Eddas, and even discussing a little bit of Homer. While in Japan, the discussion of ancient pharaohs, Romulus, Remus, Aeneas, and even the discussion of Musashi, Genji. And the thing is, the old culture is still alive and thriving, although both are cultures where people are bemoaning the fact that there's no great new literature that embodies the old stuff and I don't want to say translates it, but reinvigorates it for, I guess, a new audience. But they're still insisting on clinging to that stuff. And
if I may ask you a question, which is really I really pondered for many years about. There is something very interesting. If we have popular culture, especially American popular culture, which still is the main source for popular culture in our world today, sadly, there is something it is a two-edged blade. It is like, sadly, mostly, but also they have this ability to McDonaldize stories in a way that it is worse, but also more people consume it. So it's like yes and no, but not going too deep into that. There is the Norse mythology and the Greek mythology, which have a way of vividly returning over and over and over again, despite the reality that those cultures itself, as lived cultures, are long gone. Do you have any explanation why, especially the Nordic and the Greek mythology, are so popular still in video games, movies? I don't know. It's like an endless stream.
Well, they're beautiful stories, but
I mean, you rarely hear Celtic stories, and I'm quite certain that I don't know any, but I'm quite certain there would be very fascinating Celtic stories or Slavic myth or whatever.
Yeah,
or Egyptian for that matter.
Yeah, Egyptian and Celtic are very, very beautiful. Well, Egyptian fascinated me at one point, as did Mesopotamian and
Yeah,
Japanese.
yeah.
But Greek and Norse keep making a return. Um, I think it's might sound a little peculiar, but I think it's that the Greeks colonized the world in a way, that is to say, Europe and North
Hmm.
Africa, and then the Northmen colonized the same regions, so that we're in a way uh, heirs to these two great civilizations that respectively ended, one like 1,500 years ago violently, and the other about 1,000 years ago, and it kind of ended with, I don't want to say a whimper, but more like a gust of wind.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
still, these stories, when you read them, come roaring down across the centuries, sword in hand, a great yelp, yap, or gap, or bellow, I should say, to use an English term, a modern English term, a great bellow that resounds across the waves of time. And I think, um, I think for the Norse stories, it's that ideals of honor and bravery in the face of total annihilation and love echo across the centuries. Because, for example, Odin, the Allfather in the Norse myths, deeply loves humanity and dismembers himself almost in his hunger for
yeah,
knowledge that he might preserve humanity or protect it from demons. And you have the stories of, his great quests for knowledge. And I
yeah.
think that some of that, the honor he has, but also the hunger to learn more. These are things we can relate to in a way. We all want, but at the same time, the idea of a loving father who's there to care for you and protect you, even as he will hurl a mighty spear at you in a rage if you should misbehave.
Hmm.
Um, I think these are comforting ideas, and I think that in a way, this might sound odd, but this is a bedrock of humanity itself. Like, it's something that we are unable to separate ourselves entirely from. And now I'm a Catholic, so to me, these are, as Tolkien might put it, windows or slivers or shards, one might say, of the greater truth. So this is, at least that's how a lot of us might view it as Catholic folk. But when it
Yeah.
comes to the Greek myths, um, I cannot speak for others, but I quite like the story of Hades and Persephone, which is the predecessor to Beauty and the Beast. Um,
Hmm.
I kind of view as the great European project in a way. You have the great beast, that is to say, what can you tame it with? Uh, I don't want to say gentle, but like, can you tame the roaring bestial spirit of man through the, uh, I guess you could say, for Christians, for the power of Christ, or for those who love, Greek philosophy and Greek ideas, Stoicism. Like, I love Marcus Aurelius, so I'll use him. Like his philosophy, his
Hmm.
meditations. Can you
Yeah.
tame the inherent Nordic beast, the Germanic spirit, and refine it and hone it and use it like a laser, like through the use of the meditations?
It is
Um,
one of those things that I perceived about Odin, that in the pagan world of old, he is I am biased because he was my first connection to spirituality. I have to mention this.
He was
But I
mine as
think
for a while.
Odin is really a unique king of the gods. If you take
Yeah.
Zeus, for example, or any other king of the gods from pantheons from all over the world, Odin is a strange figure. He's a wizard more than a king. He's a wanderer wandering around in shabby robes. Though I have just recently heard there are also novels of Zeus and Hermes, I think, doing the same. There is this story of Philemon and Baucis, an ancient couple of lovers, husband and wife, and Zeus and Hermes came to a village dressed as poor beggars who had no home, and they were going from door to door asking just to be there for the night. And I'm quite certain you're aware that hospitality for a stranger was one of the great values of antiquity.
Yep.
Possibly in the world, because in a time where no idea of a world law, of one true concept of morality, the right of would it be in English, to be to stay overnight, and then it is das heilige Gastrecht, the holy right of the guest, that he comes to your door and you protect him, and whoever he is, may be a murderer, for this night you gave him your shelter, and you cannot touch him for the night. Mm-hmm. He has this right to be cared for. May the next day come, and then reckoning. But you do not. The sanctuary of the guest was very important, and breaking it was very, very dire. Even in many stories of the Jewish tradition, it shines still through that many of these calamities that happened to cities were likely because this right of the guest was violated. It's a theological speculation. I'm not going too deep into this, but I emphasize this, and this is in Greek mythology. We have this a few times in Zeus and Hermes, which is something I didn't know until a year ago. But Odin is such a stranger when it comes to, it's the All-Father, and he's not usually sitting shining on a throne and commanding angels or light spirits of light around. As a poor shabby wanderer, he's walking around and testing people. How do they react to a poor homeless, or appearing so, to someone? There is this saying, I don't know from whom it is. It is, you test the character of a person by seeing what he does to people who can do nothing for him.
I've heard it.
So, that is it's still something what impresses me about Odin, as someone who really stands out, who is not walking around doing violence, but often, even when he is one very proud king, it's for instance, it's one of the interesting things that pagan parables and Christian or Jewish parables, basically all religions have in common, is warning from hubris, warning from pride, overmuch pride. It's always the forerunner of downfall. If you take the Greeks, the Romans, the Nordic gods, the Jewish god, the Christian perspective, God. It's always, if you remember that you are a mortal man, if you go into hubris, if you go into too much pride goes before the fall. And this opened my eyes to, there is a plethora of stories, of perspective, which, no matter if monotheism, book religions, paganism, or ancient folklore or myth, are always similar undertones, like there indeed is a human wisdom that shines through these figures and stories.
Very true. I think, though, that, I'm just going to admit that of the Greek myths, I will always hold Heracles as my dearest and favorite, because I grew up with Kevin Sorbo's Hercules. So
He is, by the way, the most beloved classic hero of Christianity. So it's no surprise. Sorry, just to mention.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's with good reason. Heracles is just magical to read about. But yeah, and Heracles opens the doorway to more than even Hades, in my opinion, to horror, because he battles with monsters and tames and breaks them.
Yes.
And that's where why do you think horror? Why do you think we tell stories of monsters like the vampire or les loups-garous, werewolves? And why do we tell stories of such beasts, such monsters? Now, I think most of these monsters are...
I let you go first because I have 3 answers. So please take your time with yours first.
Right. As the student, I'll go first. I think many of these monsters are, in a way, metaphor for each one of the 7 sins, or like a great sin of man, a dark con of man. So you look at vampires, you might have lust there, because it is not that I don't tend to think of the vampire as particularly attractive, but there's it's the hypocrisy as well of someone who fancies themselves attractive, but are in reality a decomposing corpse is what the vampire is. And you look at Dracula in the Dracula novel, he's a rapist. He goes around raping women. And the way the women behave in the story, they are very evidently violated. And this shows how, in my view, we've been deconstructed and subverted into thinking the vampire is sexy, when in the 19th century, there was no such notion. The idea was you were bitten, you were violated in a way sexually by this beast. And so the men must rally and reclaim the lady's honor. They must defend her. It's this myth of St. George, really, just told in a different formula and in a different manner. The loup-garou, the werewolf, is gluttony, but is basically man's gluttonous, hungry nature. And we mustn't make any mistake. Man is a hungry creature. And gluttony can take many forms. For the artist, he devours all so that he may spit out the art he envisions. A writer might devour Shakespeare or Plutarch and cough up, a series like Rome, like the TV series Rome. You might have, how do I put it? You might have the crone from the archetypal crone, or what is it? Baba Yaga, I think it is, in Russian Slavic literature. Baba Yaga is much more of a figure who embodies, in a way, the nature of greed. Knowledge. She's greedy for what she has. You can't really steal from her. It's not a good idea. Although now that I think about it, the Minotaur also symbolizes gluttony, now that I think about it. So these are sins. These are vices of man given monstrous form in a story to teach us the dangers of that sin, the dangers of giving in to those things. But I think when it comes to a lot of the horror stories of the Brothers Grimm, we get these dark stories, but there's often a happy ending. There's the lesson that the hero who knows to apply the lesson will grow and will be able to come out of it the other side. They'll survive their time in the belly of the whale, whereas the monster won't. At least that's how I kind of look at it. But yeah, Maybe I'm more German than some because I really love the Brothers Grimm, so I grew up with them. But now, do tell me what are the three answers you have.
Right. The first is something that Jordan Peterson phrased very well, though it's not, he didn't invent it. It was an idea that was long before there, but he coined it for a modern audience. I think he said it. The concept of dragon stories is not to tell that dragons exist, but that you can defeat dragons.
I've heard the saying. I love that one.
And it is in a nutshell that the evil that the dark creatures, monsters, or people in those stories represent both something within ourselves and outside, forces of evil. It is quite a tragic development, in my very personal opinion, that we have stopped using the word evil. And I can understand from a psychological perspective, you can always argue what made this person so and so, be it genetic disposition, be it upbringing. I am not in a situation to understand everyone. Or let's say, if you are not a really evil person yourself, I think as a hypothesis, it's impossible to truly understand what it is to be evil. So we are talking about something which we do not understand. In the same way, a person who is really evil does not understand empathy. That is it's a two-side non-ability to understand each other. And that is why evil surprises good. And on the other hand, good surprises evil, because both sides have habits of doing things which never comes to their mind. But this is going back to I have this tendency to come from one topic to another.
That's fine. Go ahead.
But going back to the evil, it is the evil within and the evil without. That is the basic idea why we have horror stories of fighting against monster. It's there. It's very important, but it's, let's say, for me, the first level of complexity. The three answers are a little bit like three layers of complexity in my mind. Now there is the second, and this goes to Jung, C.G. Jung, the psychoanalyst, who was once a friend of Freud. And one of these important works is one about archetypes, which plays a huge role in mythology, but that is quite a known territory, so I won't go into that, since especially we're talking about what is the reason for dark elements in horror, in stories. And Jung wrote at length about shadow work. The idea is that we all have a shadow. That is not necessarily something evil, but usually it is, or often it is. It sides within us which we do not want to see, and then we project it and see it in others. That is usually how the shadow works. You suppress a part of yourself, and you are not aware that it is within yourself, and then you see that evil, that tendency to darkness everywhere around you. That is the shadow effect. And for Jung, the idea to deal with the shadow was a very interesting, which is why I call it second level, is to look at the shadow and reintegrate it. That is also something that Professor Peterson sometimes mentioned, is you have the beast inside yourself. And your task is not to eliminate it, because you can't eliminate it. If you do that, it just wanders like a shadow away from your view, and you think you have got rid of it, but you haven't. It just is away out of your view, and it controls you from the depths. No, you need the demon, you need the monsters in your life to be able to defend yourself. And this is the beast then on the second level is not slain, it is integrated. Like, let me think. I'm not sure if you're familiar with tarot cards.
I am.
That is the chariot. And usually today it's horses or sphinxes. But there is this idea in one of the explanations that for those who don't know, it's an image of a charioteer sitting in a chariot, and his chart is drawn by horses, sphinxes, one of the two usually. Usually one is black and one is white. And the idea is basically these are the monsters, but you control them. You need them. You need them to be powerful, to be vigilant, to be able to fight against manifest evil. You cannot be helpless. I mean, no matter if you look at pagan mythology or at Christian mythology, at angels, like there are very brutal angels, like when you think of Archangel Michael with the sword in hand. It's not like they're all singing Hosanna all the time and are pacifists. And it's the same in pagan mythology. You need strength. You need that monstrosity in a way to be able to withstand evil. You have to have your own minotaur, your own dragon within you, accept it, and then give it as a place. And one of the most interesting mythologies where this happened over centuries is the development of Set, the Egyptian god. In the classic era, Set was just a god of evil, of chaos, of foreigners, of the deadliness of the desert, and so forth. And as time passed, he was integrated, and in the later time, he was the prime defender of the ship of Ra, the sun god Ra, or creator god Ra. So this was the way how the devil, so to speak, was integrated into a positive, useful role in the mythological development of Seth.
And what's more is that you have Isis and Osiris, that you might perceive them as the heroic ones. But as the story progresses, you have Isis who tries to enslave Amun-Re, and by learning all his names and by torturing him. And so, Set seeks vengeance in the name of his king after Amun-Re is freed. And, so the murder of Osiris could be perceived under that context as a just punishment upon a weak husband who will not discipline his wife and keep her from overreaching. You know what I mean? So that Set is under this lens assuming a more and more heroic role. But what's more is that in some of the later stories, Horus the Younger, because there's two Horuses, because of course there's the brother and there's the son of Isis and Osiris. The Younger and Set end up in a weird, after an initial clash, kind of forming a weird friendship and alliance in defense of Amun-Re. So that really validates what your point is. And you look at, I was actually going to add one thing. One thing I recently learned by doing a bit of a theological study, because someone pointed me in that direction some time ago, was the development of how people regard Saint Joseph, for example, the stepfather of Jesus. Ironically, the idea over the centuries became that he obtained the title of the terror of demons, because while he was a carpenter in life, the story goes in the afterlife, he's become an angelic figure, favored on the same level as David, the king, but that Joseph is now a warrior. He has become a terror to evil and monsters, as he goes out hunting them. And anyone who insults the Blessed Virgin, he will hunt and destroy out of genuine dislike and hatred for them. Yeah. And that this is his mission appointed by God. And so he's become a saint of protection of fathers, family, but also of righteous judgment against those who besmirch the honor of the Blessed Family. So you have this figure who goes from being regarded as a very esteemed good man and transformed through the centuries, I guess, into being regarded as someone who is like a knight in shining armor for the faith. And that's a very fascinating development. I actually recently downloaded a book. Well, I paid for it, but I paid for a PDF copy. I want a physical copy later. But the paid PDF copy was cheaper. But the thing is, it's about the development of him from a psychological angle, how people regard him psychologically, and also theologically across 2,000 years. And because I honestly don't know anything about it and I want to learn. But, you know, like you said, in order to hunt a monster in a way, you need to incorporate some element of its ferocity into yourself.
Right,
so,
right, yes.
Yeah. John, but there's a point I made in a recent essay where when Dracula takes the watching glass that Jonathan Harker uses to shave, Dracula shatters it. But from that point on in the story, Dracula becomes ever more modern and ever less mystical, while Jonathan later becomes ever more chivalrous and a greater fighter and that much more mystical, it seems. So that the mysticism, the element of, I don't want to say magic, but I guess you could say magic, of the pre-modern world is being transferred from Dracula to Jonathan. And at least that's what I noticed across the book. And Dracula begins to become ever more afraid of Jonathan Harker. And Harker becomes less and less afraid of Dracula.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's like Harker becomes a monster in the eyes of Dracula, while Dracula becomes less and less of a figure to be feared and more one to be loathed and sneered at by Harker. So that, you know, Harker incorporates the bestialness of Dracula without ever becoming a monster. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that.
Yes. There is now a third level of which I have hinted, which is maybe, I'm not certain how far you will go along with it, but try to let me make my point.
Okay.
It has something to do with Lovecraft's last story, the story of Mount Kadat, something like that, which is the first book in which this world of the great old ones suddenly loses the horror. And it is always, when I read it first, I was extremely irritated why this would happen. And now let me tell you a story that I have written. I'm sorry if I'm being so selfish, but it's a story that I had written, I think 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago. And it came to me like suddenly, like not a vision that has a too religious connotation, but like it was suddenly within me. And sorry for anyone, but it's just in German anyway. I will tell the story with as little as much spoilers as possible. Anyway, it's not so important since most won't buy it anyway. So it's a vampire story. And I never was interested in vampire stories, and I would never have dreamt that I would ever in my life write something of like a vampire story. I was not a fan of any of the vampire stories at all. Maybe Bela Lugosi's films, but already Christopher Lee's Dracula was not interesting to me at all. So it was something that was possibly as far away from anything interesting me as possible. And I know none of those Hollywood film, movies, TV series. I watched none of it. So the vampire mythology is something that is quite unknown to me. I think Dance of the Vampires is the only vampire film which I ever watched, which was in the 80s or what. So it's something which I know very little about and which was very far away from me. And the story is about a vampire hunter, also from the Netherlands. Where else would a vampire hunter come from? And I have decided on purpose that the time is set in the year 1914, in the first months of the beginning of World War I. It starts a few weeks before World War I. I went to great lengths when they traveled from the Netherlands to Britain and to whatnot, to have the weather, because I wanted to. 1914 was an especially hot summer, for instance, and then I researched. Okay, they arrived there and there with the ship. How far away was the train station, and so forth and so forth. So really going into the so far that okay, this could have happened in the time. But anyway, what I wanted to point out, it's a regular vampire story of hunter and hunted at first. But I wanted to give it a twist because there is something that really bugs me. That is, I cannot live with the idea of eternal damnation. It is something that I find, obscene. I cannot make my peace with it. And so, okay, people make mistakes and we pay for mistakes, but every payment I felt had to take an ending, everyone had to have hope somewhere. If you take Tolkien, for instance, we have Sauron and we have Morgoth, the great two Dark Lords. And of course you can say they never tried to turn back to good, their own flaw, their own fault. But the idea that there is already in Tolkien, if you know the Silmarillion, there is this like Iluvatar and the Valar, which is God and his angels or God and his lower gods, are singing fate de facto. So that is the one critique which I had is if these things are fated, how can you blame the evil person? I don't want to go too deep within it because otherwise I will go into a critique of Christianity, forgive me, but I go back to my novel for that. It's like the story of the Garden of Eden. It's something where I, like Emperor Julian, have great question marks as a pagan, but not going into this, letting this rest. Back to my novel. There is this idea a person had doomed himself by a stupid decision or was doomed, like bitten by a vampire and became a vampire against his willing. And you can say, well, you can go to a vampire hunter and let yourself be killed. But, well, he says, there is nothing that I did wrong. And so there is a conundrum of some sorts. And I wanted to heighten the conundrum by, while this happened, the vampire hunter gets ever closer to the vampire, and he realizes there are several clans or groups, and this is a group of vampires who researches a way out of this dilemma in which they're in, of having to drink human blood. They are at the point of the novel already a little bit advanced in this. And the dilemma that the vampire hunter, who comes from a long tradition of monster hunters and vampire hunters, which is mentioned in the book, like the writings of his father who was killed by a vampire, the writing of his grandfather who hunted monsters in Africa, and so forth, back to many generations of protecting humans from the evil monsters. And he is now in a situation where he gets news from the newspapers while he is hunting the vampire of the ongoing of World War I. And there is this, it's not spoken, it is not said, but there is this underlying change of perspective that I try to bring into the story. Who is the monster? Humans or vampires? In a time where humans are slaying each other by the million, and even the worst vampire are killing one per month. So it's this question is, what makes the monster? Where are we humans in relations to the other? Let me take another angle to highlight this maybe. You know Star Trek?
Yeah,
Generally,
yeah.
The interesting thing about Star Trek or many other such stories, like stay with Tolkien, is all races or species that we like are similar to humans. And humans have this tendency. Let's imagine, for example, out in space there is an intelligent race. I'm speaking not fictionally. Let's just imagine an intelligent, extremely highly intelligent and extremely benevolent group race out there on planet, I don't know, Alpha Centauri, whatever. And they meet us and they look like giant metal spiders. For instance, what would our reaction be? Or let's take all this modern fiction about the what is it called? The reptiloids, where we think, oh, we are undermined by reptiloids, aliens who look like reptilian. Like there is this difference in West, there is always the evil dragons. If you go to Asia, it's a very much more complex about dragons. And this was like a light bulb above my head many decades ago, where I thought humans have a prejudice to think that which looks like them, that which looks angelic must be good, and that which looks strange, weird, frightening must be evil. And that was an issue that I wanted to tackle, which I was not content with. I was not happy with that perception. And that is the third layer, is who is the true monster? Like, I mean, if you take Frankenstein's story, that is the most apparent of Mary Shelley, that is the most apparent. Who is the monster? The man or the monster?
It's a good question.
Because the monster did not make himself to be. He was made into being against his will, and he was sold. There is this saying, I remember it from the novel of Mary Shelley, where the monster Frankenstein, not the person, the classic, what is seen as the monster, says, for the love of one being, he demands the Dr. Frankenstein to make a wife, one like him to love, and the monster says, for the love of one single, I would forfeit all the hate that I have within me. But if I cannot have love, I shall indulge in the hatred, for this is all that is then left to me.
I'm going to be honest, though. I think that the monstrous serves as a valuable teaching tool, but those who do not look like us, let's take, for example, I'm not a big fan of sci-fi, but StarCraft's Protoss. I don't know if you know them.
No. Sorry.
Okay. They were a telepathic race in a science fiction RTS game, real-time strategy game. But in there, the Protoss don't really look human. They don't behave in a way that is at all human. And their concepts and their way of thinking is very different from humanity's. And at the beginning of the story, them and the humans don't like each other. They actively hate each other. But they're threatened by a bug-like race that seeks to infect, destroy, and otherwise consume all others. But over the course of several games, humanity and these Protoss have to team up. But it's an uneasy alliance at first. In a few books, they often come down to blows. The Protoss look kind of monstrous, to be honest. But they have very, I guess you'd say, human souls. But I must confess that my own feelings about dragons are influenced as much by Asian depictions of dragons, as well as by the movie Dragonheart in the 90s, where the dragon, voiced by Sean Connery,
I remember, yeah.
That, you know, in there, the dragon is a teacher. He is a mentor, and he embodies and seems to pass along Christian ideals of chivalry and piety, I guess you could say, and goodness. And so I must confess that had a big impact on me as a child, so that I kind of like dragons as a mythological creature, but I kind of view it as they're much more interesting, intelligent, and having, whether evil or good, because there's also the Children of Hurin story where the dragon is evil and demonic, but can hold a conversation. And I must confess, I'm currently clashing with a lot of writers on Twitter who keep insisting the dragons must be ever more bestial, ever more animalistic. While
yes,
which I'm getting tired of, but I want,
yes, indeed.
And I keep pushing. We need the dragons to be more intelligent. I want them to be able. It's fine if they're alien, if they think differently from us. That's even more interesting. But like, why can't we take inspiration from Asian dragons in stories like Spirited Away, where the dragon's a young boy and is intelligent and holds conversations and philosophical dialogues and whatnot. Dragonheart's basically just one big Socratic dialogue between Bowen, played by Dennis Quaid, and Draco. They're just having constant Socratic dialogue. Why can't we have that? Oh, well, that's not cool. That's not.
I mean, even we have this in Tolkien, the famous in the famous conversation between Bilbo and Smaug.
Oh, I love that scene. I love that part.
Even so, as a dragon expert, I have to say it's not a dragon, it's a wyvern. But all right, at least in the film, it's a wyvern but that's a little bit my the dragon fan within me speaking. It wasn't a dragon, it was a wyvern. Sorry. A dragon is a hexapod. He has two legs at the legs, 2 legs at the front, and then 2 more wings. So, but sorry, it's my dragon fandom speaking.
Well, I like the dragons to have Socratic dialogues or be master schemers in demonic figures. I want them either as great wise teachers or as demonic monsters.
Yeah,
I just think it more fascinating for them to be full of, I guess, what I call deep lore, but apparently I'm in the minority, as I keep running into people, mostly Anglo-Saxons, saying, well, this won't do. We need the dragons to be animalistic, to be bestial.
I know. Yeah.
No, it's boring.
Isn't it a little bit, might we agree, maybe a little bit something very American?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them are American. And I say Anglo-Saxon. It's just I tend to think of, I call all the English people of New Zealand, Australia, England, US, and Canada Anglo-Saxon. They just seem to have the same culture and whatnot. Well, the English of England seem a little different, I will confess. They're more Europeanized, and to an extent, I think I think of that as a compliment. I quite like Europe. Europe is so much more interesting than North America, I must confess. And the thing is, though, a lot of these, it's primarily Americans, but there are some non-American Anglo-Saxons. They tend to think, well, dragons must be bestial, and they need it Americanized. But is a villain or a mentor more interesting because of how dumb they are, or are they more interesting when they're cunning and witty and knowledgeable?
Right.
And
right.
But I've been clashing with them because they like George R. R. Martin and his stories.
I know. Yes, horrible. I must say, I profoundly dislike the man and the story.
So
I'm sorry if that just hurts some fans of it. First, his fascination with, I'm sorry to say, at the risk of sounding prudish, but his fascination with obscenity is I can understand you can write a so-called modern version. It wouldn't be for me because I'm not interested. When I read Lord of the Rings, I don't want to know if that before they say, I don't know, let's go on the quest, but let's all go to the toilet before. I don't need to know these things. I
Same.
assume they do this, you see, but this doesn't come to my mind. I don't need to know all these things or whatever they do. I assume even the people of Middle Earth have sexual desires. I presume, since they are humans, and I don't know, elves, but I don't want to know it because it's out of place. It serves no purpose that I have, because I know this already. This is like many of the depressive stories. I don't know if you noticed, the 1990s were a great break in storytelling. Suddenly, I was a great fan of Batman comics at the time. And what I noticed, the other comics of DC and Marvel, I was not so interested in, but I loosely followed them. And I realized in the 1990s, suddenly heroes stopped to be heroes. They all had to be broken. Everything became darker and grimmer, and to a point that there was no hope, no light, no ideal. Everyone was tainted. Everyone was rotten. And
Agreed.
this was so. I think we even now in 2024 are still climbing towards an apex of ever more senseless, meaningless stories through this. And what once at a time it was interesting because it was rare, because it was unique. Like, oh, you see a broken hero who becomes anti-hero for like the counterpoint, like if you have food, and I'm sorry, I'm butchering this parable because I have no idea about cooking, but there is this in cooking, like to have a counterweight in taste to make the other taste more standout.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in that concept, I can understand the value of the broken hero, of the dark, more or less hopeless story. Let's take Alien, for example. But it makes only sense because the majority of stories is not like it. As soon as the majority of stories is like it, it stops making any sense.
And the other
That is what people don't realize. The storytellers of today do not realize this.
And the trouble is that I keep running into writers who say we want to counter Martin's stories, but we need the dragons to be less intelligent than his. We need them more bestial than his. But his dragons are already bestial and stupid and monstrous. But they want them even more so. They wish to counter Martin by becoming ever more Martinian, I guess you'd say. And I just think it laughable and pathetic. I'm supposed to respect them. I'm supposed to speak well of them, but I just find it exhausting and pathetic. I don't have, okay, if you want to write animalistic dragons, there's a place for it in literature. I will agree. Mm-hmm. Fine, you can. It's not for me to dictate what your literature is. But I'm probably not going to read it because it's not for me. I like my dragons either to be cunning Glaurongs and Smaugs, or wise old Dracos, or Hakus. That was his name. I was struggling for a minute. Haku.
Yeah, right.
But, and that brings us to another point. You wanted us to discuss the inner reality of Lovecraft and Tolkien. When you said that, I was intrigued, and the inner reality. By that, do you mean the internal reality within the self, or within, that they explore within their stories? Because them and Robert E. Howard all explore the idea that with knowledge comes ever greater madness, even as more of yourself, your internal self, in a way, is laid bare for you to discern. And sometimes it's not all that pretty, other times it is. So that I know many might not agree with me, but the fascinating thing about Frodo and Sam's journey to Mount Doom is how different they are. Frodo wished to be good. He wished to do the right thing, and he is good. But what was laid bare before him in Mount Doom was that he could not fight the Dark Lord. He gave in to the inner madness. He gained ever greater knowledge, of himself and of the world around him and gave way to madness. Sam did gain similar knowledge, but Sam became ever saner, ever more eager to cling to the Shire. But he also had love. He had Rosie to bind him, I guess you could say, to act like a lightning rod for him with reality. And I wonder, I guess what I'm wondering is, for us scholars, the closer we come to some truth, to some idea, do we become ever more divorced from reality in a way? Is that the message here? And the same truth or facet of reality might be revealed to, say, a gardener, and yet he clings to reality where, a scholar might not, because Frodo is a scholar. Sam is not. Mm-hmm. And Sam, it's laid bare what he is. He's a simple gardener. That's all he ever wants to be. And the endings of the two characters are very different. Frodo, the wound, his wound continues and festers until he just can't bear it anymore, and he has to journey to the west. While Sam...
You do know, by the way, that I didn't know until a few years that Sam travels all by himself to the west later as well.
Yep.
After the death of his wife, I read just a few years ago, after the death of his wife, he follows Frodo, true to himself, to his friend Frodo, say, I follow you wherever you go. My wife is dead. My family is living on their own. I follow you into the West. I found this very interesting. But there is something, if we compare Lovecraft and Tolkien, here there is something which I felt was always dissatisfying me on the ending in Lord of the Rings. And that is the ending itself, comparing to Lovecraft. Now you say the ending in Lovecraft is madness. The ending of Tolkien is the world is saved, but is it? And that is something which I have to bring a little bit also Friedrich Nietzsche into the fold, because I believe there is something which lies beyond madness.
Well, I was just going to project.
Go ahead.
I've not read Lovecraft. I was just going to say, all I know is that he has that theme of...
It's not so important. I will not go too deep into Lovecraft, so it's not so important to know.
With Tolkien, the ending is Dagor Dagorath, so the world ends in a great heated fight.
Oh, okay. If you go that far, all right. All right. But I sort of cut this out in my internal law, because it's more like it can be like this. It's more like maybe it's like this. I mean, if we stay in the Lord of the Rings and maybe the Silmarillion as the story before, there is this notion that I feel that the ending is bad because magic is out of the world. Humans are on their own. The dwarves are dying out. The hobbits are dying out. The elves are either reduced to unimportant forest spirits, or all leave. All magic leave. All wonders are leaving the world. And I found this ending in this perspective extremely bleak and depressing. I did not find this a good ending. That is the one thing. And then there is this. Going to Nietzsche, I know you mentioned you read the Zarathustra. Yeah. There is this point, if you look less on one single book, but on the development of Nietzsche. We know he ended in some sort of illness. Was it madness? Was it syphilis? We don't know. But the interesting point, Nietzsche is essentially undoing the divine, undoing religion and spirituality. His materialism and his anti-spiritualism is quite strong. And yet he inches always a bit forward to a point where I feel, Friedrich, you are standing one step before stepping over madness back into faith, back into spirituality. The spirituality in these writings at some point almost becomes tangible, but he revolts against this in his nihilistic materialism. He does not want it. He cannot bring himself to make this step back into spirituality. He sees only madness and says, no. I don't go. This is a go back, which I think he is wrong. He overcame some form of stagnant religiosity, transcended it, but what he should have done would make full circle. And where he just saw the end, the madness, and see only the overman, only strength, only power, only worldly things are meaningful. What we decide, well, the winner takes it all mentality, all these things. It's so tangible to me that he was just centimeters away from stepping into spirituality, even finding some sort of enlightenment, but he didn't dare to take this final step. And this is when I take back to Lovecraft. There is this last story, the walking to the mysterious mountain of Kadat, which is, I think, his last published stories, if I'm correct. And suddenly the monstrosity is almost gone. It's still weird, alien, but it becomes more and more fascinating and has a beauty of its own. And where at first what he met was frightening because it was different, suddenly becomes interesting and of value in itself. And you may or may not know, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a materialist and atheist very much himself. And when I read his stories, I see the same problem that Lovecraft had and Nietzsche had. They're in their subconscious, they were crawling towards spirituality, but they didn't dare to make the step. They were so fixated in their atheistic materialism, they didn't dare, even though their subconscious led them almost to the doorstep, to the fringe of where they had to make one more step, and the whole world would come back from bot to top and to the feet back down to earth, and the head up to the head to the sky where it belongs.
I'm just processing.
Take your time. It's an exotic theory. I know. I know that very few ever said this about Nietzsche. There are not so much people speculating about Lovecraft, but I know that of the plethora of Nietzsche interpretation, it's as far as I know, I'm the only one who has this theory. So I don't blame you if you find it outlandish or implausible.
No, it's just that, well, I'm processing a lot of info here. Yeah, shows apropos the thing about Lovecraft is, I must admit that I have not read almost anything at all. I've just started listening to an audiobook of one of his first stories, On the Hills of Madness, I think. And it's because I have an American friend, Isaac Young, who is a fellow writer, but he likes cosmics, horror, and writes the finest sci-fi I've read of our current era. But the thing about, now I will ask, what is the attraction of Lovecraft's horror? I'm genuinely curious. What attracted you to him?
One theory that I have is, living in a materialistic, nihilistic era, as we do, people are dried. The soul is like dried of something. they want to feel what I call the world beyond. This is a very pagan perspective, I say, but however, as a Catholic, you may take it. There is this longing for the return of magic, the return of miracles, the return of wonder, and this dissatisfaction with the mundane.
Mm-hmm.
There is this quote, I don't remember from whom it was, and I don't get it really right, but paraphrasing it, it was something like, from Davila it was, from Gomez Davila it was. The quote was, the enemies of the mythos, of mythology, are not the friends of realism, but of banality. And that is that is the point. When the world has no longer miracles, no burning bushes, no dragons, then the world is not real, it is banal.
I think when it comes to, how do I put it? There is something in Tolkien. I guess for me, the reason I like the Dagger-Daggeroth ending, where Morgoth and Sauron lay their armies before those of Manwë, and you have the armies of light and darkness aligned against each other. I guess what I like about it is that it's one last throw of the dice, one last enchantment, and then you get the music of the Ainur. I think that there's a theory I've been seeing a lot of Catholics discuss on Substack, is that the world must be re-enchanted. The past 200 years has seen it disenchanted. And the idea is that the world is an enchanted, magical place. And things like magic and wonder and whatnot were once commonplace. Men believed in wonder, like even if magic isn't, there's an explanation for it. But even if, the trouble is we don't believe in wonder anymore. It's all materialism. It's all what you can touch, what you can, like, the solid is now the god in a way. But the thing is, men must, we need stories that will restore the enchantment, the wonder of the world. It's not for nothing that, for example, Frederick II was called Stupor Mundi, the great wonder of the world, and because he was so amazingly intelligent. But such intelligence was considered a great wonder at the time. And it still is, I would argue, today. But you look at just like Tolkien, for example, his story, weirdly, I prefer the Silmarillion. And what I find weird, now the thing about the ending to Lord of the Rings, like you said, there's a disenchantment that happens. There's a death of magic and wonder. And I kind of think that the Silmarillion is more mesmerizing because it has more enchantment. It has more magic to it.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the world needs more wonder in it, more enchantment. And this might sound odd, but I think that the more there's wonder in the world, the more there's honor and love and goodness. Maybe I'm odd for linking the two together, but the less wondrous a people or the world seems, the less, I guess, virtuous people are. And
absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I am at the risk of making myself unpopular with some of the audience, but to my view, I've said this often enough, so when they hear it on my channel, they hear nothing new. I am very vividly against atheism in all its forms. And it's not that I dislike atheists. They are good people
Yeah.
despite atheism. That's my perspective. Despite their materialism, they are good. As remnants of the old spiritual and religious sources of good. They live on the remains of what came from there. But as Jordan Peterson put it so well, if you pull that rug of religion and mythos away, it does not last for very long. And I have yet to see one single explanation of a materialistic atheist why people should be good if there is no God. There is none. I'm sorry, there is none. They say, oh, it's empathy. I'm sorry. I don't want to go political, but you can imagine a topic where empathy in the West is currently misused. It's always the question, empathy with whom, to what degree. There is no virtue that can not be abused if you have not the recurring idea to mythology and to religion. It does not work. Only if Socrates wrote this in Phaedrus, which is my get-to-go religious view, that we were all children of the gods, lived with the gods, and then incarnated in the world and reincarnate so many times, proving ourselves good people to rise up to the side of the gods. That is my basic view on the world. And if we are not the children of the divine, if we are merely matter, we do not matter. Forgive me the wordplay.
No, it's brilliant. It's true. And it's why, like, how do I put it? Believing in nothing has served to reduce the world to nothing. It has killed the magic of living. It's no wonder that suicide rates and murder rates have skyrocketed. Why shouldn't men, like, the thing is, how do I put it? When morality comes from a mass of people, a great gray goo of a people who have been stripped of their every tradition and their every traditional ideal and every idea that was once sacred to them, then nothing is sacred and there is no morality. Yeah. But if morality comes from up above, you're not able to, like, breaking it is suddenly a taboo. You need to, you need to kneel before it. You need to humble yourself before it. So that, like, for example, take our, like, you look at, say, the manner in which, there are things I like about him and there are things I don't like about him. You look at Napoleon. He was a great, arrogant guy. He was very impressive in his accomplishments, but he was an arrogant buffoon in a way because he did not, morality came from his belief in liberalism. So everybody could vote together on and decide what the cultural value and what the, what is good. So at that point, if everyone can vote for what is good, nothing is good, because when everyone has a vote on it, nothing really gets decided. But you compare him to, say, St. Louis, who had a tendency to bathe lepers, to care for the sick, to organize great welfare for widows. He consulted all the time with merchants' guilds, with the poor. He may have been king, but he was not shut up in the palace. You look at Charlemagne, saying, like, he did a lot of good for his people as well. But they believed that this was their Christian duty. Heck, I'll even point at Augustus Caesar. He thought that he had to do right by his people when he became the supreme power over Rome. He had to go out in the streets and dispense welfare. He had to make sure that Roman people were fed. He needed to make sure that the provinces were well run, that there was good architecture, there was good aqueducts. He needed to restructure the city, organize the roads, pave the streets. He needed to do all this. Why did he have to do it? It's his duty. Where did duty come from? It came from above him. As a ruler, he is obligated to serve his people. The ruler is servant. But this is where it's so strange in our democracies, because today, like, for example, we might elect, I don't know, I'm not going to use an actual figure because I could actually get in trouble. But let's say Joe Blow. We'll say Joe Blow. Joe Blow is elected prime minister or president, let's say. I know it's not an actual office, but president of Canada. What's his duty? Well, given that he has been voted into office, like he has supreme power over the nation, more than any king in pre-revolutionary period ever had. So he has absolute power. There's no real checks and balances. We can pretend that there are, but there aren't.
Just a small interjection. Isn't that interesting? Because the general populace believes that democracy, the people in power, are the weakest when the reverse is true. No form of government, and I'm saying this as a staunch defender of the republic in contrast to democracy, as a strong defender of the republic, still no governing person is so much in the position to be absolutely autocratic than a democratic elected one, where kings, aristocrats have their limits. Someone who can say, I have the majority of the people behind me, he can do everything.
Exactly. And that's the problem. And the other thing is, what if he decides, well, I don't really like this idea of limits. I don't really like this idea. I should have no limits. I'm always right. But like you look at today, let's say they had a referendum from today to tomorrow. What's moral? If I kill 1 million people for fun, let's have a referendum. We'll decide if it's right or wrong. Well, like the very fact that, now I know people would say that would never happen, but I think it totally could happen. It wouldn't surprise me. And the trouble is, he could have a referendum. Well, which million people? Like, you know what I mean? Like, if you put it to American votes, like, should let's say we have a referendum, we're going to invite a bunch of Canadians into, or Germans into the U.S. and then slaughter them all for your entertainment. Would you guys, like, yes or no? And at that point, you kind of wonder, well, that's not right. But here's the thing. In a perfect democracy where everybody can vote on what's right or wrong, shouldn't everyone have a vote? The problem is, I guess I just find with our current structure, with our current atheistic, materialistic view, we're not uplifting all the boats, but we're leveling down all the mountains, so to speak.
Yes.
Whereas if we enchant the world, and that's why we need horror, why we need myths. It's about uplifting all the boats. It's about lifting them all up out of the sea and carrying them up to the heights of the mountains. At least that's how I think. And
that is why, to try to bring some sort of the circle around, is why we need the horror, the monster, not just for the reasons which we mentioned already, but the monster is the realization that there is a spiritual darkness, the darkness of not knowing yourself, the darkness of not knowing the light, in whatever you call it, God, enlightenment. It is, I am not fixated, and I am at the time, as we speak, of the opinion that many variants of seeing the divine or the light are correct in as much as it speaks to that person or that. I brought once the example, like it's a little bit like Schrödinger's cat. It can be one, it can be many, it can be the divine nature that you value life. It can be the writings of sacred scriptures, whatever it is. There is something Okay, but that's not neither here nor there. Going back to the myth, we need that transcendent darkness to understand that there is a transcendent light.
There's a reason why.
Because if that is going back to, if we have dragons just like evil animals, it's just an extension of the materialistic view. Like there was this movie of where humans were besieged by hundreds of dragons, but I think there was only one female dragon or something like that.
I've seen that one. It's quite good.
Yeah, they defeated the dragons by defeating that one female dragon in the long run. But that was, the dragons were just like, I don't know, supersized insects. And I found this boring. It was a spectacle, but it was boring because there was nothing. What was the story then, other than the most terrible perspective that we can possibly take? Might makes right. If you are powerful enough, you win the future. And that can't possibly, you see, it's both when we look at Christianity and we look at paganism. I have to add, but the side, I'm a reform paganist, so my view may or may not be representative. But I've always said, if you take the single God or the many gods, it's not that they are right because they are powerful. It is that they are powerful because they are right.
That's a very good phrase.
So I am always, I'm really tired of all this. You probably may understand, of all these video games, which are full of, animes, mangas, films, let's kill the gods. So it's like a trope. I'm so sick and tired of it. Like, the divine is not like an Ubermensch who commands you because of the power, but the divine is a principle of perfect goodness, whether it is personified or abstract, like the force. That's not so relevant. It is the supreme power you cannot beat, not because it has the biggest club or the greatest thunderbolt or whatever, but because it is the supreme good. That is why it is unbeatable, not because it has the great club or the great spear or the great hosts or what have you.
And there's a reason why, how do I put it? There's a reason why I myself am really quite tired of the same. And what many of the atheists tend to forget is that, I'll take the Christian, I hope you don't mind. What Jesus says at one point is, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, but blessed are you when you are abused, for having clung to me. He's saying, so long as you cling, you will be abused if you cling to my divine truth, if you cling to me. The more tightly you love me and you cling to me, the more the world will abuse you and seek to destroy you. But I will love you for it, and I will bless you for it, and you will receive your reward, whether in this life or the next. And this sort of vision of the divine as, well, we spoke of the All-Father at the beginning. I'm a former pagan, and what lured me to paganism was Odin. And the thing is, that we got to bear in mind is there's a war in a way on divine truth, but it's also, how do I put it? We have, in anime and fiction like that, we have to go and destroy the embodiment of light, of the divine and whatnot. But doesn't that mean that the characters are trying to destroy the light that exists within their own souls, and they're going to usher forth nothing but darkness within themselves and in the world they inhabit?
I think it is greatly born of this atheist commentary on any religion, that religious times were the evil dark times, no matter if pagan or Christian. And that seeped into all storytelling about anything mythological, divine, and so forth. It's really like an uphill battle to face this.
I must confess, of all the atheist writers, I don't read too many of them anymore. I'm just mostly bored. Although my favorites are probably Mark Twain for his Jeanne d'Arc novel, because, she's my favorite saint, probably, along with Paul. But because, she loved France. And to me, nothing sparks the fire of passion and brings, I guess, tears to my eyes as La douce France éternelle, the knowledge I have a nation, even if I am not within her boundaries. But we once spoke of that before, and you said this is how you felt for Prussia, I believe. And
more so for Rome. I am a Roman priest for a quite long time.
Oh.
I am member of two Roman groups, international groups. Prussian in a part, but I am more Roman than anything else. If you ask me for my identity today, I know that it might sound crazy, like, Rome is dead for I don't know how many 2,000 years or what, but
it lives still.
Ask me, that is my cives Romanus sum.
I must admit to loving Rome also. So, but I'm French, but there are other French who tend to consider France kind of Rome.
Roman virtues and Prussian virtues have some overlapping, so they're not so dissimilar.
Yeah, they do. And, I've recently begun thinking, I'll get to that at the end, but when it comes to, I lost my train of thought, but when it comes to, atheist writers, I also like Ken Follett with his Pillars of the Earth, which is about the building of a cathedral. And it's about the lives of the peasants who go about trying to build it. Even as the nobility and the higher ranks, a bishop, a higher ranking official of the church, hate people trying to build the cathedral and want to stop it from being built. And the nobility really despise the idea of this cathedral because it pricks their pride, and they're envious of the passion and the love with which these peasants pour into their sculptures, into their glass making, into their just everything related to
Is it a realistic depiction of the era, or is this a more fantasy?
This is a historic novel, and it's...
the perspectives of the nobles and the clergy of the time, would they have felt like that, or is this an atheist making things up?
He decided to capture the people of the time. So you have Etienne, or Stephen, who's fairly generous, if a little weak-willed, but he means well, and he loves the church. In turn, you have Prior Philip, who people today would probably say all sorts of stuff about him, but the decisions he makes in the novel, I've seen a lot of people today disagree with it, but an Englishman of the 12th century probably would have made those same decisions. Because for him, everything, or almost everything, must be sacrificed for the church. But he also is the same man who, while he tries to bully one young boy who's a sculptor into becoming a monk, he is also the same man who gives his donkey to a man who wronged him and then walks, I think, 1,000 miles on sandals to get back to his church. and humbles himself before this man who hated him. And I've seen readers say that is unimaginable. Why would he do that? Why would he humble himself before someone who hated him? But the thing is, he's an abbot. And this was a rival for his title of abbot. And he sees the man reduced to nothing, to homelessness. And he feels horrified by it, the idea, and breaks down crying in front of this former political rival of his and says, come home. I need you, my brother. And it's unimaginable to people today, but it's a very beautiful scene. But a lot of the characters, the question of legitimacy, for example, between a married couple who are living in sin together, becomes something that troubles them and breaks them apart for a time, because just a question of living in sin is horrifying to them. And then they come back later and marry, but they have to have their marriage. It's like an obsession for them. They cannot have children out of wedlock. They don't have any children, but you know what I mean? Like things like that, which is fairly historically accurate. Maybe an atheist, but he was determined to have it. He was determined to try to capture the English of the time and the French of the time. And his later novels are strewn with modern day sentiments and ideas and thinking. But his first book, Pillars of the Earth, is very medieval. You know what I mean? Maybe not in the language, but when I say language, I mean the dialogue. But it's filled with characters you might have found in Chaucer. And it's quite good. But yeah, that would be, but many writers of today cannot seem to capture the mindset of the pre-modern. And, but especially in French, but, I've been recently just thinking that the French values out not to be liberté, égalité, fraternité. I really have begun to hate that phrase. For me, it should be bonté, piété, fraternité. That is to say, grace or goodness. Bonté, piété, piety or pietas. I love the Roman pietas. And of course, fraternité, fraternity. So, because all French people are brothers and sisters. And that's what I think should be our values, not this meaningless sentence of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Because since the sentence was hammered into French skulls, or I should say branded into their skulls, since 1789, it seems like there is no equality and there is no, it's liberty versus freedom in English, I guess you could say. Liberty means being free from all previous restraints, while freedom means to be free to live your life. Free just overall. I prefer
as
freedom.
a classical liberal in the political sense, I have to add the singular freedom or liberty is greatly misleading. And in a very English way, I prefer to call it liberties, because liberties is a concrete list of things. Like we agree in a society to a concrete list of liberties, unless the specter, which is the liberty, which is liberty to what? Like there is no unending liberty, which the name suggests. But the problem is, I have said this many times in my German videos, there is no virtue, no good idea, which is so perfect that it cannot be used for evil. That is the human problem. Everything, grace, mercy, the most benevolent ideas that you can consider can be and have been used for terror. and horror.
Mm.
That is where I am more on the side of a Socrates, of someone who wanted to connect with the divine, like he said in his Phaedros, but also thinks, okay, we have to debate this. We have to seek out insight, but that is probably where we say, okay, we have different perspectives upon this. Where we agree or probably are on the same page is that we need to take to step over the material world. And if the present time and the spread of fantasy, of stories, let me take you to the most outrageous example. You will probably protest and wave the crucifix against me when I say this. But just as a thought experiment, you know what a furry is? A person, a furry. Those people dressing like animals, like dogs or like deers or whatever. You have heard of this?
Yeah, a little.
Yeah. So when you look at their lives, you may find this for a plethora of reasons weird, ungodly, whatever you wish. However, I have an education as a druid and as a shaman. Shamanism and druidism talking me to connect to trees, and I have for many years learned totem animal spirituality, like having this experience of animal forms which let you view a different perspective on life, which in your human limited scope is not there. Anyway, I'm just saying this. And there, as I said at some time earlier, I believe that there are many passages that the divine, in my personal view, you don't have to agree, just to say it, is not so close-minded that it would say there is this pathway of this and all. But anyway, the point is, if I look at these people, what do I see? I see more than people who just are misled by demons to tyrannical, perverted ways. What I see is people who tap into very ancient pathways of seeking. As perfect or imperfect as these ancient paths may have been, think of all the shamanism of tribal times long past. It is like the spiritual world is calling, but the minds of humans are so clouded, so distorted, so much broken that, like, if you see something through many layers of broken glass, you see it so distorted in a way. And I see that in so many things that people do, that we both may say this is stupid, this is silly, that is maybe a sin. I don't agree in the term, but for the sake of argument, in many ways absurd, wrong, misleading, there is still this, I cannot let go of this idea, which maybe brings me again closer to you, that there is something that has not its origin in the divine light. That what is evil is, in the sense, force applied wrongly in the wrong sense, in the wrong dimension. Like if you take, for instance, greed. The normal measure is, and I'm arguing here with Aristotle, is your body has the desire to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to protect yourself with a home. So what is greed then? An overdoing of something that in itself is normal. So it's the measure, like if you do not care for your body given to you by gods or God to fulfill your role here, and you die of starvation, then you forfeit the task why you have been sent here, why your life has meaning here. That is my perspective when I see the many strange occurrences of people going to the extreme in things we may or may not like, or even say they are from the devil or whatever have you. There is still something that draws them to this seeking something higher, to transcend the mundanity of just being a material product of evolution.
Yeah, I think people hunger for just being more than what they are. But I must confess, when I first started writing as a young boy, I was obsessed with the concept of eternity. What did it mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, would my writings make me eternal? Now I've long since stopped taking an interest in such a notion, but it seems narcissistic now. But as a child, I was fascinated by the notion also of when you're writing, when you commit something to paper, is it forever? And I think now that when people go looking for something greater than themselves in any form, they are seeking something that's older than them and that'll be there after them. So, as we might call it, eternal or eternity. And it's just part of the human condition to want to be more than what we are, to aspire to be more than what we are today. And now I know a great many people will constantly get disappointed when I say I don't see the point in going to Mars, for example. But and I don't think we're going to make it to Mars in the next 5 to 10 years, like a lot of people keep saying we will. But I think, we might land a man there, but we won't put anything lasting there. But like a flag is not what I mean. Like I mean like a building or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I think reaching for the stars, so to speak, is our most natural condition. We want to reach for something just beyond our reach. And I hope that's not too poor a choice of words. But I think we are there's a turn of phrase in the Dynasty Warriors 7 video game where the Jin Dynasty characters kept saying to all the other characters, you should accept your limitations. And what was so fascinating to me when I played that game as an adolescent was all the characters took offense at the statement, but the thing is, the characters of that kingdom took it as a matter of fact. One must accept one's limitations as a human being. And I think we are limited, but we are also connected to something greater than us. But I think this is what troubles a great many people. As to the source of evil, I like the phrase, so dark the con of man. I think it does come from within man, but also because Christian, the devil. But I guess I view darkness and evil as the weaker urges of man, and they show the weakness within a man. So that, I just think, I guess, for me, seeing the triumph of, say, Aragorn over his foes is something that showcases the strength of man, while, let's say, the anti-hero is someone who if he can overcome his dark con, he transcends what he once was, and that we all want to transcend what we were. I don't know if that
I
answers
guess
that.
I have here a little bit or quite a bit more a pagan view, which is all right. We can agree to disagree because, as I said, I quoted this Socrates, and the hero archetype is something that is very prevalent among pagan thinking. And for me, I've said something sometimes in jest, but not altogether. If you put me on the Star Trek, on the space Starship Enterprise, and I would live forever, always discovering new worlds, always discovering new things, it would be something that I would face eternity and never tire of the new challenge. Or take our Minister of Finance, Herr Schäuble, not a very sympathetic man, by the way, but he said something interesting. He once said he regards Sisyphus as a happy person. And that is a very pagan thing to say, if I may say so, that the challenge is not glorious because I've wrote a book, a text about it. I may send it to you at some times if you are interested, which is the Christian or the biblical view of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and I think of a handful of others like Zoroastrianism, I don't know, have this idea of a linearity, like there is a creation, there is a middle, and there is an end, like the salvation or the Dagolas of Tolkien, which you mentioned. Paganism is like a circle, or maybe like a spiral, no matter. Like it has no beginning, and it has no end. It is the adventure that always goes on. That is the difference. One is the idea that the life is a circle, maybe a spiral upward, if you want to be optimistic. That's depending. But it is also very Chinese to think that things can never change. And this is one of the points where I'm very skeptical with the Oriental perspectives, like this of the Middle East, also of the Far East, like there is a setting that is predestined, and there is no way you ever step more. It's something that I, let's say, decided not to like. But my friend, we are getting close to 3 hours.
Yeah, I think we're going to.
And we are wandering in in different areas. Do you have any closing ideas?
Well, not really, no. We've explored quite a bit of ground about the mythic, about the horror. The most I might say is that it would be a delight to speak more with you, especially if it's ever about a specific story. But, and by that I mean, I don't know, I don't have anything that comes to mind at once, but I must say I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So I'll first thank you, and also just say that in place of a subscribe, I'll tell people that I'll be, at least where I post this video, I'll be putting the link to your YouTube channel and encouraging everyone to subscribe to you.
Likewise. I will do likewise.
And I'll remind my fans, I have a crowdfund for a book. And if they're feeling a little uncomfortable with a crowdfund, over on Substack, I have